afsakið biðina hérna en við vorum með smá tæknilega örðuleika. En hérna bara velkomin öll sömul á þennan fyrirlestur á vegum öndvegisverkefnisins milli manns og náttúru. Fyrirlesarinn okkar í dag er Colmán Ó Clabaigh sem er Benediktínamunkur í Glenstarklaustrinu í Limerick á Írlandi og miðaldafræðingur sem hefur fengist við sögu klausturmenningar á Írlandi. Og í dag ætlar hann akkurat að fjalla Benediktína á Írlandi. So, come on.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone understand my accent? No, the guys from Ireland should be okay on this. We've heard so much about genetic makeup, and 60% of Icelanders having some Irish genetic makeup in them that I presume that you'll be able to follow the West of Ireland accent. My name is Colmán Ó Clabaigh, as Sigrún has already indicated. I'm a Benedictine monk, and I'm here in Ireland with a group of students from our high school, from our secondary school, which is Glenstal Abbey School in County Limerick. We've primarily been doing a geography trip, but today is sort of history day, and Steinunn, Christian's daughter, inveigled me into giving this lecture, which sort of dovetails with her own very exciting research project on the between man and nature, the making of Benedictine settlements in Ireland. So what I'm going to do here today is give a broad overview of the Benedictine monastic tradition in Ireland, and hopefully be able to establish some links with your own tradition here as well. As an Irish monk, I'm slightly nervous about standing in front of an audience of Vikings. Our relations have not always been very good here, but I come bearing some potential slaves. So if any of you would like to purchase any of the young men that are at the back of the room there, I would willingly give up some of them for nothing at this stage. But anyway, let's go. So we had a wonderful presentation in the Árni Magnússon Institute just now with Professor Sigurdsson on some of the manuscripts from the Icelandic tradition. Containing the sagas, containing a lot of the historical material and some liturgical material as well, but particularly focusing on links between Ireland and Iceland. And we know that these links go back to the various earliest days of settlement here, the reference to the papar, the hermits that the first Norse settlers encounter here. And they seem to disappear fairly shortly afterwards, so you know that might be another chapter of history worth either investigating or glossing over. But what would these papar have looked like? Well, in the Icelandic text, which actually saw in the flesh for the first time today, it refers to these Irish hermits with their bells and their books and their pastoral staffs, okay? So this is what a papar would have looked like. These are from illustrations of early Irish monks dating back to the 8th and 9th century from County Fermanagh in the north of Ireland. You can see them there with the short walking stick type, which was the symbol of the monastic vocation and also of spiritual authority, and then the bell. Professor Sigurdsson informed me that some of these bells have been found here in Iceland as well, which was something that I hadn't known. So that's what I would have looked like if I was standing before you maybe 1200 years ago. Similarly, the Steinunn's project is looking at the impact of monasticism on the landscape here in Iceland. And again, there's a lot of parallels with the Irish experience, because Christianity comes to Ireland in the 4th and 5th centuries into a society that hasn't been Romanized. There's no classical tradition there. So we don't have in Ireland structures like basilicas that can be adapted for Roman purposes. We have to come up with our own ideas for this, how a church should be organized, how a church should look like. And what happens is we adapt to local circumstances. The early ecclesiastical communities, the early monastic communities, took secular residences and expanded them. They used this as the basis for monastic observance. And it was traditional, I don't know what the situation in Iceland was, but it was traditional in Irish society up until about the 12th century for the status of a chieftain to be indicated by the number of concentric rings that surrounded his fort. Okay, so an ordinary farmer would have a single ring, a single enclosure, and then maybe a second, a more powerful chieftain would have maybe two, and then a local king would have three enclosures enclosing their homestead. What the Christians do, the early church planners as it were, is they take this and they expand it. You know, I had a laser a second ago. Oh yes. So this is a site in the north of Ireland, Nendrum. So you can see the three concentric circles here. It's on a tidal inlet, which they used to power a tidal mill, one of the earliest in Europe. In this outer area, and they named these areas Sanctus, Sanctior, and Sanctissimus. So this idea of gradated spaces. So the Sanctus, and all of these under the protection of the local saint, the charmon from the Latin word terminus, meaning a sanctuary. So once you were inside this boundary, you were part of that monastic community. You were a monarch, regardless of whether you were married, regardless of whether you were celibate or in priest orders or whatever. So the outer area was very often where they kept livestock and cattle, and also people who were seeking sanctuary on the sites. This is where this sort of the ne'er-do-wells, the criminal element will be found. In the inner area, you had people living in lawful matrimony. Now, these are from highly idealized law texts, but it's what we have to work with. And then in the center, surrounding the church and the cemetery area, you had the monastic core, the religious core of the building there. Now that's a ruined site, but in many cases in Ireland, these early Christian sites have left their imprint on the landscape. So this is the cathedral city of Armagh in the north of Ireland. The head of the Irish Church, the Archbishop of Armagh, is still the successor of St. Patrick, both in the Roman Catholic and the Anglican traditions. That's the medieval cathedral in the centre there. These are the clergy houses, many of them still inhabited by Anglican clergymen. And then you can see how the town has grown up around the ecclesiastical precinct, but actually respecting the earlier boundaries that were there. And you find this all over the country. You find this all over Ireland. So I'd be really interested maybe afterwards to hear if there's anything similar to that in Iceland. There were a few things I saw yesterday as we were driving down the south shore that made me wonder about parishes and chieftains' dwellings and whatever. Okay, this church had a particularly rich artistic tradition. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, certainly all the Irish guys will be. Mr. Toomey. Thank you. And this is the Derrin Flan hoard. This actually has a connection with our school because the guy who found this was a student in our school about 40 years ago. And so this is a Eucharistic 9th century, 8th to 9th century Eucharistic set, found hidden as a hoard. At a monastic site at Derrin Flan, and possibly hidden because of a Viking raid, or possibly because of a raid by another monastic church. This warring between different church sites is quite common, ecclesiastical sites. I don't know if there's anything to parallel that in Ireland. And similarly, the literary tradition, like we saw, or the manuscript tradition, many of you will be familiar with this text, which is the Book of Kells. And 9th century copy of the Gospel book, the great wonder of the Western world as it's described in the 11th century when it's stolen from the church at Kells. But every significant monastery would have had something like this. And just some more details from it here. We saw a beautiful image in the Arne Magnusson Institute of Madonna and Child from, I think, the 13th century. Here you have an 8th century version of it. Current thought is that the Book of Kells was produced on the island monastery of Iona, and then moved back to Ireland. But every major monastery would have had something comparable. Now, to move to talk about the Benedictines, in my own community, there is a story that our first founder, Glenstall is a very recent foundation. It was established in 1927, and the first man to enter the community was a man called Father Bernard O.D., and he met an English Benedictine monk. Now, the English have a very venerable and unbroken monastic Benedictine tradition, and he introduced himself as an Irish Benedictine. And the English monk said to him, "An Irish Benedictine? I have never heard anything so preposterous in my life," which rather bridled with the man. And the Englishman continued and he said, "My dear chap, Irishmen are temperamentally unsuited to Benedictine life. Our motto is peace and our hallmark is moderation." So there's this perception, and you find it in even some of the modern literature, that there's something about the Benedictine way that doesn't lend itself to the harsh ascetic temperament of the Irish. Now, as a bit of racial and social stereotyping, that's as good as it gets. But this is not the case. What you're looking at here is the earliest copy of the Rule of St Benedict that survives from Ireland. It survives in an Anglo-Norman context from Dublin. It's from the Abbey of St Thomas's in Thomas Street in Dublin, dating to the late 13th and 14th century. So there you have the beginning, the rule, the Asculta o Filii, listen my son to the master's voice. Just up there, and they sort of the rubricated and the decorated initial there. And here you have a really interesting commentary on the Rule of St Benedict. And if I wasn't spending my time bringing my students around Iceland, this is what I'd be trying to decipher. This seems to be a unique commentary on the rule. So, what are the Benedictine links with the continent and with the Western world? Well, we'll start in the Mediterranean and work up. The tombstone that you see here is a very significant one. It's found in a Roman church, the Church of San Stefano Rotondo on the Chéilian Hill. And it commemorates the death of a man called Donnacha O'Brien in the year 1064. Donnacha O'Brien is the son of Brian Boru. We've already come across him today in the Njal's saga, the sort of the rival of Sigtrygg Silkbeard, the king of Dublin there. And this tombstone alleges that he came to Rome and he died there, and having renounced the crown of Ireland. So this sort of left it free for the Pope to bestow it on someone else. And that will be done with unfortunate consequences in the next century when papal permission is given for the invasion of Ireland. However, an Irish king has to find somewhere to stay in Rome. There's no Airbnb at this stage. The nearest that we have are the two Irish monastic communities following the Rule of St Benedict on the Chéilian Hill. And it would appear that, like many other national groups, Irishmen travelled to Rome as pilgrims and then stayed there, adopted as monastic life, and offered hospitality to their co-religionists who were coming to the holy city there. Another important link is with Germany. Irish people, I can't think of his name, it's gone out of my head, are noticed as that generation who above, or that nation who above any race love to wander. The Irish will sort of drift off anywhere and you'll find them. I was talking about the Catholic Church here in Iceland. There is apparently two Irish priests here, and I know one of them. That's what Ireland is like. And in fact, I'm beginning to learn that Iceland is even more compact than that. There are two important Irish Benedictine foundations in Cologne, St Pantaleon and, St Pantaleon, this particular one. And it appears that in the year 1028, around about the year 1028, King Sigtrygg Silkbeard, this Hiberno-Norse king of Dublin and of Man, who, as I said, is mentioned in Njal's saga in the context of the Battle of Clontarf. makes a pilgrimage to Rome. And it appears that his route took him through Cologne. And very recently, as in the last 3 years, a German scholar, Dagmar Oreen Redl, has demonstrated that on his return journey to Ireland, he brought with him a community of Benedictine monks, some liturgical manuscripts, and used these to establish a cathedral church in Dublin, Christ Church Cathedral. And you can see it there. None of the original, none of his buildings survives, but this element here is the 12th century element. And Benedictine monks remained there as the cathedral chapter, singing the divine offices for about 80 years until they were expelled by an Archbishop of Dublin. Now, there's a number of sort of exciting consequences of this. As you are establishing a church, there are a number of texts and manuscripts you have to bring with you. You know, sort of Christianity 101, the Fool's Guide to Christianity, or to the liturgy. You have to bring relics of the saints with you, and you also have to bring what's called a martyrology, a listing of the feasts day by day, which gives shape to the liturgy and how it's worked. This is the relic list from Holy Trinity in a early 16th century hand, and a lot of the relics are from Cologne and from Germany. And similarly, in the martyrology, in the listing of the saints that has been found here, or that was brought, that came to Dublin, we find many German and Bavarian saints as well. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is the martyrology of Christ Church, this text listing all the saints' feast days, was in turn copied for use in another cathedral church, and that was the Cathedral Church of Lund in Sweden. So I'm just sort of intrigued, and I want to throw it out to any of the historians or the liturgical scholars here, that possibly a similar link might be found with some of the Icelandic material. It's just a kite that I'm flying, but I think it's worth doing, and what better audience to do it with. Okay. There were a number of Irish monasteries in medieval Germany, some of which grouped together into a congregation dedicated to St. James. St. James, the patron saint of pilgrims, and many of these monasteries are founded in southern Germany along the Danube, and also, primarily along the Danube, as pilgrim hostels for people who are making their way either to Rome or to Compostela. The mother house is this monastery here, the Abbey of St. James in Regensburg, and the congregation comes to be known as the Schottenkloster, the Irish monasteries, because up until the 12th century, Scot meant an Irishman. Schotten meant an Irishman, so that's preserved in that name there. Where did these guys get their recruits from? Well, they recruited almost entirely from Munster, from the southern province of Ireland. They had a number, they had 2 priories in Ireland where they recruited novices, and Dr. Cormac here tells me that after she and I parted, she walked out, and some of my own students were sitting round outside the institute, and her colleagues were asking her, are they all trainee monks? Okay, so just throwing that out there, guys. Career options that you may not have normally thought of. Our school captain is shaking his head there. Okay, so novices were recruited in Munster and sent out to staff these monasteries in Regensburg. This is, and again, the influences are 2 ways. A number of architectural historians have traced German influences on the one of the buildings, Cormac's Chapel on the Rock of Cashel there. Now, other foundations include St. James in Erfurt, and then you have a number here, the Schottenstift in Vienna, which is still functioning as a Benedictine monastery to the present, but is now staffed by Austrians. But again, this one here in Kelheim, this is a very simple pilgrims hostel. And here in Eichstätt, they build a copy of the Edicule, or Christ's tomb in Jerusalem, so that people who couldn't make it as far as Jerusalem could at least make it as far as Eichstätt and have a similar experience there. I mentioned that most of the recruits for these monasteries came from Munster, from the southern province. This manuscript turned up 12 years ago in a collection of fragments. And through a bizarre set of circumstances, it was identified as a manuscript produced by an Irish Benedictine monk in Regensburg in the 12th century. It's the oldest manuscript to survive from that community. Now, it's a litany of the saints, you know, so a fairly standard piece of liturgical material. But there are a few, I'll just move over here. There are a few, if I can find them, ones that stand out. Yeah, up here. St. Patrick, St. Brendan, St. Columba, St. Finan, St. Catherine, St. Ailbe, St. Decun Nessa, St. Melua, St. Clelia, St. Angus, St. Senan there. All of these are Irish saints, but they are turning up in a Bavarian manuscript. So this is what identifies it as. It could only come from an Irish context. And all of these saints here come from an area of about 20 square miles in the southwest of Ireland around a town called Killaloo. So what you're looking at here is some Irish scribe, a Benedictine monk sitting in his monastery in Regensburg, far from home, transcribing a manuscript that, you know, is needed for worship and casting his mind back to his childhood in Ireland and to whoever the local saints were, and including them in the litany that he and his brothers will sing in Germany as a way of connecting with the home place there. So it's sort of, you know, you see something like that, it puts a very human face on the experience. Okay, what about Benedictine nuns in medieval Ireland? I wrote a chapter in a book called The Irish Benedictines. That is The Irish Benedictines, a copy of which is going to go to the library, I think, after this. This is one of the sort of problems you face as a historian, because you rarely get to work with sources that tell you good news, okay? A lot of the time. You nearly always get sort of court cases or stuff that doesn't edify. There are 8 references that I was able to discover relating to Benedictine nuns in Ireland, 5 of them related to pregnancies. So, you know, if you're going to write a history of female monasticism, you'd get a very skewed picture of it just from the sources that survive. We do, however, know that a number of the Irish community of Benedictine nuns in Regensburg also recruited in Ireland, in Munster. We just have the names of 4 nuns from Regensburg, but they're all have the surname O'Brien. So they are recruited from the royal house of Brian Boru, of the O'Brien family in the west of Ireland there. Now, so that's looking at the German connection. I want to move and talk a little bit about the English connection. There are close connections, obviously, between Ireland and its sister island, many of them positive, some not so positive. But there are, the tradition emerges of Irishmen entering English monasteries. And a number of these monasteries, like Winchester, and also, like Winchester particularly, have large Irish contingents, Winchester and Worcester. And this is reflected in some of the source material that survives from Ireland, notably this musical manuscript, which is now thought to have been from Lismore in County Waterford in the southeast of Ireland. So what you have is, again, English Benedictines coming over, or Irishmen who trained in the English Benedictine monasteries coming over, bringing with them liturgical texts and knowledge of the Benedictine tradition there as well. The Cluny, the Great Reform movement of the 10th century, has one representative house in Ireland, and the only thing that survives of it is that. a seal that was found by a young boy out fishing on the River Shannon in the 1930s. And this is the seal of the Priory of St. Peter and St. Paul. We have documentary evidence, but nothing survives above ground there. In the 12th century, monasticism in Ireland is reformed or reinvigorated, and it follows Benedictine lines, but in the context of the Cistercian reform. So as you can see, there are quite a number of Cistercian foundations established in Ireland in the 12th century there. Some of them by Gaelic founders, and then after 1169, many of them by Anglo-Norman founders. This is a little problematic. Professor Sigurdsson was telling us a story earlier about reconciliation here between where a woman from one faction has to marry the man who murdered her husband just shortly beforehand. We can do that in Ireland as well. This is a romantic painting from the 19th century of the marriage of the King of Leinster's daughter, Aoife, to, you see her here, to Strongbow, Richard de Clare, the head of the Normans who come to Ireland. And through that marriage, he gains the right to the lordship, to the kingship of Leinster here. But as you can see, as wedding parties go, it's not perhaps the happiest. You've dead bodies strewn down here. The musician is trying to make music, but the strings on his harp are torn. But the new foundations, both Benedictine and Cistercian, that the Normans make, are firmly established in the context of colonization, of helping the new lords get a grip on their land. And the land on which my own monastery, and which our school stands in Glenstall, was actually a part of a 40,000 acre grant of land to an English Cistercian monastery to help in the colonization process at the end of the 12th century. Some of the churches that benefited from this, some of the Benedictine communities, were the Benedictine Cathedral Priory at Canterbury in England. This was granted land in the southwest of Ireland in County Wexford. These are the actual grants themselves, these indentured grants. This particular charter here relates to this church at a place called Tom Haggart in County Wexford. So what happens here is that they're granted the income from the church, the tithes, and the right to appoint the clergy for the church there. So again, this close link between the establishment of, let's say, a manor or a parish and the establishment of a small monastic cell or a church on the site. And again, there may be parallels in the Icelandic situation. Similar, St. Torans Abbey in Évreux in Normandy was granted large amounts of land at this site 4 in County Westmeath, some of the most fertile land in the country. You see some of them there. Yes, these are just other images from the site. You see the columbarium, the dovecot there, the 15th century cloister, and then sort of another view of the site. Ubiquitous sheep. St. Werburgh's Abbey in Chester establishes an important foundation in the northeast of Ireland at Downpatrick in County Down. So they send 12 monks over to establish the cathedral, or to take over the running of the cathedral there. And the reliquary that you see on the left-hand side here is the shrine of St. Patrick's Arm. And this was preserved in Downpatrick up until the 16th century. It's now in the Ulster Museum. And Downpatrick was one of the sites that you visited if you were making the pilgrimage to Lough Derg, to St. Patrick's Purgatory, probably the best known Irish site in the Middle Ages there. Similarly, this in Little Malvern Priory here in in Worcestershire in England was granted this church, St. Bridget's Church in Castleknock in County Dublin, along with 4,000 acres of land. okay? Now, not many of you will be familiar with land prices in Ireland, but all I can say is that if we today possessed 4,000 acres of land in Castleknock on the outskirts of Dublin, we could be doing a lot of very exciting things. This is some of the most valuable land in Ireland. But there's a wonderful a letter in one of the Bishop's Chronicles from Worcester, where a monk from Little Malvern is refusing to go to Ireland. He has produced a letter from a quidam medicus, from a certain doctor, saying that it would be injurious to his health to go and live amongst such wild and barbarous people. Okay, so yeah, that's Castleknock. St Nicholas Priory in Exeter in the southwest of England also has a land in County Tipperary, not too far from Glenstal, in fact. Bath Abbey in Somerset is given the income and the right to appoint chaplains to 3 hospitals in the southwest of Ireland, including this one in Njal in County Cork. These Irish foundations tend to be places where you send incompetent superiors or people who can't live with other members of the community. So it's always useful to have an sort of offshore island in which you can send recalcitrant or difficult people to live with. In current political usage, being Secretary of State for Northern Ireland fulfills that role for the British government. It's how to get rid of your most awkward member of cabinet. So the tradition continues there. How does this end? Well, many of these monasteries were monasteries in name only. They were property holding consortia and used, many of them had passed into the possession of families. But the death knell here occurs during the reign of perhaps the most identifiable figure in Western European art, thanks to Hans Holbein. And this was the dissolution of the monasteries from the 1530s, 1538 onwards. And this is how it will be seen from a Catholic perspective in the 1640s. This is how the Annals of the Four Masters were called. This was compiled by a team of historians presided over by a Franciscan friar called Colmán Ó Clabaigh. A heresy and new error sprang up in England through pride, vainglory, avarice and lust, and through many strange sciences, so that the men of England went into opposition to the Pope and to Rome. They styled the king the chief head of the Church of God in his own kingdom. They destroyed the orders to whom worldly possessions were allowed, namely the monks, canons, nuns, brethren of the cross, and the 4 poor orders, that is, the orders of the minors, the preachers, the Carmelites, and the Augustinians. And all the lordships and livings of these were taken up for the king. They broke down the monasteries and sold their roofs and bells, so that from Arden of the Saint to the Achaean Sea, there was not one monastery that was not broken and shattered, with the exception of a few in Ireland, of whom the English took no notice or heed. They afterwards burned the images, shrines, and relics of the saints of Ireland and England. They likewise burned the celebrated image of the Blessed Virgin Mary at Trim, which used to be performing wonders and miracles, and to heal the deaf and the crippled and people afflicted with every kind of disease. They also burned the staff of Jesus. I mentioned Bockles at the beginning. This is an example from the National Museum of Ireland, which was in Dublin, performing miracles from the time of St. Patrick down to this time, and had been in the hands of Christ while he was amongst men. The legend was that Christ had handed this staff to St. Patrick in a vision on the island of Lerins, and that it also had been the staff of Moses. So when Moses was finished with it, he handed it back, and then St. Patrick gets it later. So, what to say? It seemed like that was the end of the story, but in the 17th century, a group of very intrepid women, Irish women, led by this lady, Abbess Butler of Ypres, reinvigorated or rekindled the Benedictine tradition. And her community at Ypres survived there until the First World War. That's what it looks like before the city of Ypres was bombarded, and that's what it looked like afterwards. And that community has now moved to Ireland, or still exists in Ireland, at a place called Kylemore Abbey in Connemara. And it sort of takes us back to what is the motto of the mother house of the Benedictine order, which is Monte Cassino in Italy, St Benedict's major foundation, which has been destroyed 4 times, most recently during World War II at the Battle of Monte Cassino. So the monks there have got a bit used to it, and their image is that of a tree that has been cut down but manages to send forth a fruit or a root or stalk again. So Chisa vericiat, cut back, it springs up again. Thank you very much.
Questions from the audience?
Thank you very much for the lecture. I was wondering about the recruiting of Irish to German Benedictine monasteries.
Uh-huh.
Was it the Germans which were initiating this, or where?
No, these monasteries, so the question that had been asked was who initiated the recruitment of these Irish monks to German monasteries. These monasteries were Irish foundations. They were initially started by Irishmen, in a small number of cases Irish women as well, and those communities maintained links with Ireland. So the best organised of them was the group that are known as the Schotten cluster, and that consisted of 11 monasteries spread from Vienna to Kiev in the Ukraine to Regensburg, and they recruited their novices in Ireland, mostly from the south of Ireland. So they remained exclusively Irish foundations until the 15th century. And the last Irish monks were kicked out of Vienna in 1515. So that's, I don't know, does that answer the question? So it was, the initiative came from Irish people, or from Irishmen, but with the support of local lords or local magnates who saw them as a useful thing to support.
So why did the Irish originally go?
Why did the Irish? There is again. This is something. Why did they come to Iceland? There is. I mentioned this sort of as a joke, but this was something. That the Irish, who above any race love to wander, and there are a number of theories as to why Irish people, Irish monks in particular, why do the Papar set off for Shetland and the Faroe Islands and Iceland, when no one else is doing that? There are a number of theories about it. One is that they have this idea that they are at the end of the earth, and that by their duty is to convert the world or make the Christian message known before Christ can come again. Okay. Another theory is that the Irish Church from the 7th and 8th century is heavily influenced by the literature of early monasticism, and particularly the literature of the Egyptian desert, where you have these heroic hermit figures heading out into the sands of the desert to sort of wrestle with their demons and give praise to God. Ireland isn't noted for its sunshine or its desert conditions. So they make do with what they have, which are these little offshore islands. So that's why so many of the monastic foundations in Ireland, the early ones, are found on the islands off the west, around the coast, and then they start going further afield, eventually ending up in Iceland, and if we are to believe a 12th century text from Regensburg, eventually discovering America, St. Brendan, the Navigatio, the voyage of St. Brendan. I don't know, does that answer the... Okay, thank you. That has been put forward as a theory by a man called Thomas Cahill in a book called, he actually only died recently, I think, called How the Irish Saved Civilization. There's an element of truth to it, but he overstates the case there. What did the Irish do? They kept certain texts alive. They also, because of the fact, and again we saw this in some of the manuscripts this morning, because Ireland is outside the Roman Empire, in order to be able to access the Christian message, you had to teach people Latin. So that means that right from the beginning, you know, they were acquiring a pedagogical skill, or they were picking up a command of Latin grammar, particularly, that wasn't really widespread, because, you know, if it's what you've grown up with, you don't pay attention to it. If you have to learn a new language and pick up the elements of grammar there, which the Irish did. So after the scripture books, the next highest proportion of manuscripts that survive in an Irish context are grammatical texts. They're for teaching people. And they were also unusually very open to preserving the classics, works that in other monasteries were set aside as being too risky or too unchristian or whatever, were often copied in an Irish context because, you know, they enjoyed a good story and could entrusted their critical faculties when it came to it. I don't know, does that? Yeah, good.
Just a minor addition to what you just said. It is my understanding that one of the things that the Irish did do was invent punctuation marks as we now know them.
I'm aware of that. I can't speak with any authority on it, but yes, I defer to, I think it is in that context. And again, largely because Latin is an acquired language, right, so that you then have to break up the words in order to make sense of it. Yeah. That's a very good question, and one which I would not dare to answer in a room full of scholars of Icelandic history here. But I'm going to attempt, and you can jump in on me. The Irish, I suspect that whatever monastic rule the Papar, the first monks here was not influenced by Benedictine monasticism, which really only becomes widespread on the continent from the 9th century onwards. It's just the Benedictine rule is one of several rules that are circulating, and it owes its influence to the work of the Carolingians, and particularly Louis the Pious in the 9th century. So what I think, and again, this is just, we don't have the evidence for it. Whatever would have shaped the lifestyle of those hermits would have been what they had learned in their own communities. And the impression that we're getting now, and this is largely to the work of Dr. Edel Vranach, that a lot of the monastic teaching was done as, was transmitted orally. So you might be given a short saying to meditate on or whatever, and eventually these were collected together and formed a corpus of monastic legislation or inspirational texts, very much similar to the sayings of the Desert Fathers, the way that Egyptian monastery was translated. So I don't think that the Irish monks that were in Iceland would have been in any fashion Benedictine. Would you? Yeah, I'm getting a nod over here, and a very vigorous nod down here. So.
It's
Mhm.
One has heard that the foundation of the Irish Church is quite different from mainland Europe
Mm.
in that way that it is closer to the origin of the Mediterranean Church, the apostles of the Church of Christ, and so on.
Mhm.
Which leads us to Middle Ages when there was a lot of tension between the English Church and the Irish Church, and how was that resolved and that. And then on with the James, with the rift of the English Church from the Papal Church,
Mhm.
Rome.
Mhm.
And a time on Ireland was more or less under the yoke of the English.
Mhm.
And as you said, they broke down the monasteries
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
all that kinds. And even later, they, as you said, they took over a lot of the monasteries and
Mhm.
churches. And one has read that especially in the 18th century,
Mhm.
19th century, when there was people were starving, famine, and things, they set up what they call nowadays we call it a soup kitchen.
Right, yes, yeah,
And
yeah.
they try to convert people.
Yeah.
How manage the Irish to defend against all these
Okay.
influences?
Yeah, no, those are wonderful questions. I actually teach a course on that. So if you want to tune in online over about 3 months, I'll be able to answer your questions. Can I attempt to say something about 3 of them very briefly, because I'm conscious of time here. The first one, Mediterranean links. That's been the really exciting discovery of recent years. Archaeology, because before this, when we were talking about the narrative of Christian origins in Ireland, we were using literary sources. We were using the Confession of St. Patrick or what law text said or whatever. Archaeology is showing us that there are direct trading links, particularly in the south and the southwest of Ireland, with the Mediterranean. And I'm thinking particularly of the work of a man called Professor Tomás Ó Clabaigh. So there does seem to be a direct Mediterranean link, maybe mediated through Spain as well. About 20 years ago, a Psalter, a book of the Psalms, was found, miraculously preserved in a bog, in a peat bog. And when the archaeologists examined it, they found the inside cover was lined with papyrus. Now, papyrus is something that does not grow in Ireland. It cannot survive in Ireland, but it's an indicator of, just how ideas circulate on materials that haven't survived in the archaeological record there. With regard to the 16th century, the Reformation in Ireland is a very complex situation. Unlike England, not all of the monasteries were wiped out within 4 years. About 60% of them were, but 40% of the monasteries, and we're talking about nearly 400 monasteries in Ireland in the 16th century, survived. So that acted as a link to counter Reformation Catholicism and becomes a channel there. Do you mind if I leave it at that? It's as much as I can do.
Might be able to squeeze one question in if
Any of my students? My students then afterwards. Okay, we're not leaving this room until I get one question from you. Okay. Oh, no, please, no, they'll have to think about it.
Not everybody believes in the Papa word in Iceland.
Right, okay.
So did the Irish have the technology to make the crossing, the Atlantic to Iceland in the 9th
Now,
century? Or when do you think they came?
in my school, we play a game called rugby. Okay, our rugby captain is here, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong on this, okay? Sometimes you get thrown a ball and you don't know what to do with it, and you kick it into touch. Is that correct? Yes. So you just remove it. I am not going to attempt to answer that question. I simply don't know. But there are people in the room who do. So if they would like to, St. Brendan, yeah. Like there's certainly the Irish, when you look at, there's a text of, I really feel now that I'm, there's a category of literature known as the Imrama, which are sort of sea voyages. And they recount, sometimes in a secular context, sometimes in a church context, these voyages that are made by the Irish. And one of the most famous of these is the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, the Voyage of St. Brendan, which preserves a lot of information that could only come from real experience of sailing in the North Atlantic. You know, descriptions of icebergs, of whales, of parts of the world where night does not end for 2 or 3 months. There's a geographer, an Irish geographer called Dickul, who talks about Irish hermits on the Faroe Islands who are able to pick lice out of their habits at midnight because the sun is so bright during the summer. So I think they certainly had the technology. But now how, and that's one of the questions, how, you know, getting to Iceland is a big... Jim Severin, yeah, there was in the 1970s, an English adventurer reconstructed or built a boat out of wood and leather hides, and he actually crossed the Atlantic in it. He sailed from Ireland to the Faroe Islands, I think, then to Iceland, Greenland, and then to New York. There, people would argue as to whether the model that he used was, you know, maybe a 15th century model for an earlier period, but it could be done. Long voyages were certainly not beyond the capability of the Irish. Mr. Toomey, you're raising your hand there. Where are we going for lunch? Yeah, that's now. This is it's a packed lunch, Mr. Toomey, and it's in the boot of the bus at the moment. Mr. O'Donnell.
Would it be possible to go back to your slide on Benedict O'Brien?
Yes. Only if you say please in Icelandic.
There's a word.
Oh, there's no word for please in Icelandic. Fionn has been learning Icelandic for the... Right.
Thanks. What is a funerary plague?
Oh, a plague, yes. Thank you very much. Now, there is always, I don't know if there's an Icelandic word for smart arse, but there's always someone, it's a plaque. Thank you. You may be swimming back to Ireland after this. Okay.
I think this is a perfect time
Yes.
to have some lunch, maybe. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming. There is some coffee, I think. There should be coffee and some cakes for you all. And yes.
Okay, thank you.
Again.
And thank you for the opportunity.